What would you do if you fell for someone you could never have? A professor and a student. Two worlds that should never collide. But sometimes, fate has other plans. When I started my math class that semester, I never imagined my professor would become my greatest temptation. He was reserved, serious, always maintaining a professional demeanor. But beneath that cold exterior, there was something magnetic about him. A lingering glance, an accidental touch, a silence heavy with meaning. Over time, the barrier between us began to crumble, revealing a forbidden desire that neither of us could ignore. But how far can you go when your heart wants something your mind forbids? If you love intense, emotionally charged stories, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a second of this journey. The classroom was silent, except for the scratching of pens against notebooks and the occasional squeak of a marker against the whiteboard. Professor Daniel Carter was standing at the front, his sharp gaze fixed on the equations he was writing. He was precise, methodical, and completely absorbed in his lecture, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. I tried to focus on the numbers, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. His neatly rolled-up sleeves revealed forearms lined with subtle veins, his watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. He was in his early 40s, and unlike the other professors who seemed exhausted by years of teaching, there was something undeniably captivating about him, something controlled, restrained, and yet magnetic. I never thought I'd be drawn to someone like him. But there I was, sitting in the middle of the lecture hall, hanging on to every word, not because of the subject, but because of the man delivering it. "Logan," his voice cut through my thoughts, deep and firm. I snapped my head up, realizing too late that I'd been staring. A few students chuckled quietly, and my face burned. "Are you following?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my pulse quicken. Yes, Professor," I stammered, gripping my pen a little too tightly. He studied me for a brief moment, then gave a curt nod before turning back to the board. My heart was still racing. I needed to stop. This was just admiration, right? Respect for a brilliant mind. But deep down, I already knew I was lying to myself. As class ended and students gathered their things, I hesitated. I wanted to say something, anything, but what? Before I could decide, Daniel looked in my direction again. This time his gaze lingered for just a second too long. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just in my head. I told myself I was imagining things. That lingering glance, the brief hesitation, surely it was nothing. Professor Carter was just being professional, ensuring I was keeping up with the lecture. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unspoken between us. The next class, I was more conscious of myself than ever before. Every time he moved, every time he called on a student, I felt hyper-aware of his presence. I told myself to focus on the equations, to concentrate on the theorems and formulas he was explaining, but my mind kept betraying me. At the end of the lecture, I stayed behind, pretending to pack my things slowly as the other students trickled out of the room. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe for him to acknowledge me, maybe for some kind of sign that I hadn't imagined everything. "You seemed distracted today." His voice cut through the empty classroom, and I felt my breath hitch. I turned to see him watching me, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. There was no trace of amusement in his expression, only that same unreadable intensity. No, just a lot on my mind," I replied, gripping my bag strap. He nodded slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "If you need any clarification, you can always stay after class. I hold office hours for a reason." The words were neutral, professional, but there was something about the way he said them, deliberate, careful. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Thanks, Professor Carter." For a second, I thought he was going to say something else, but instead he pushed off from the desk and gathered his papers. I should have left. I should have turned and walked out like any other student. But something kept me rooted in place. And then, just as he reached for his briefcase, he glanced at me again. This time, it wasn't just a glance. It was something else. Something I didn't have the words for yet. The air between us felt charged, heavy with something I didn't understand but could feel deep in my chest. I left the classroom before I did something reckless, my pulse racing as I stepped into the hallway. This was dangerous. I knew that. But for the first time, I didn't care. For the next few days, I convinced myself that everything was in my head, that the glances, the tension, the way my heart pounded whenever I was in his presence, it was all just misplaced admiration. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more undeniable it became. And then, it happened. That afternoon, I found myself lingering outside Professor Carter's office door. I told myself I was here for extra help, nothing more, nothing less. I knocked, and his deep voice called me in. He was seated at his desk, glasses perched on his nose, focused on the paper he was grading. The room smelled like coffee and faint traces of his cologne, something sharp and masculine. "Logan?" he greeted, setting his pen down as he looked up. His expression was composed, as always, but I swore there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? Curiosity? I just had a few questions about today's lecture," I said quickly, forcing myself to sound casual. "Of course." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." I sat down, but my mind was a mess. I flipped open my notebook, but the formulas and equations blurred together. I could feel the weight of his gaze, steady and unreadable. "What are you struggling with?" he asked, his voice calm. "Everything." Instead, I pointed at an equation, something I barely remembered from class, and he leaned closer, explaining it in that deep, measured voice of his. I was supposed to be paying attention to the math, but all I could focus on was how close he was, how the soft creases at the corners of his eyes deepened when he concentrated. And then, it happened. So subtle, so quick. I almost thought I imagined it. His hand brushed against mine as he reached for my notebook. It should have been nothing. A fleeting accident. But neither of us moved. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw it. The hesitation. The internal battle in his eyes. He knew it too. I swallowed hard. "Professor." He inhaled sharply and pulled back as if burned. The mask was back. The carefully controlled expression. The professional distance. He stood, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't..." He exhaled, looking anywhere but at me. "This can't happen." I felt something tighten in my chest. "I didn't say anything would." He looked at me then, and it was the first time I saw something close to frustration in his expression. "You don't have to. We both know there's a line here, Logan." I clenched my fists under the desk. I never asked for this, and neither did I. His voice was quiet now, almost pained. Silence stretched between us, thick with everything we couldn't say. I should have left. I should have picked up my things and walked out. But I couldn't. Instead, I stood, slowly, testing the tension between us. "Tell me you don't feel it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter." "But you do." He turned away, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to erase the thought. "It doesn't change anything." I felt something ache deep inside me, but I nodded, even though I hated it. I walked to the door, placing my hand on the knob, and for a moment I thought he would stop me. But he didn't. and as I stepped out into the hallway, my heart was racing for all the wrong reasons. This wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed were agonizing. I tried to act normal in class, but every time Professor Carter looked at me, I felt that same tension creeping in. It was unbearable, this unspoken thing between us, the weight of something that shouldn't exist but did. I told myself I needed space, that I had to let it go, and then fate intervened. That Friday, I was heading back to my dorm when I spotted him across the street, outside a quiet cafe. He wasn't in his usual dress shirt and slacks, just a dark sweater and jeans, looking like any other man lost in thought. I should have kept walking, but my feet had a different plan. I crossed the street, hesitating for only a second before stepping inside the cafe. He was seated in the corner, a book open in front of him, a coffee in his hand. He didn't see me at first, but then his gaze lifted, and everything stopped. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no classroom, no lectures, no rules, just two people standing at the edge of something dangerous. I cleared my throat. "Mind if I sit?" He hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. I sat across from him, my heart pounding. "Didn't take you for a cafe guy." A small wry smile tugged at his lips. I like the quiet. I nodded, fingers drumming against the table. I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't." His voice was softer than usual. He closed his book, studying me for a long moment. "Logan, this isn't..." He sighed, shaking his head. "We shouldn't be here." "Then why didn't you tell me to leave?" His jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw a crack in his restraint. "Because I'm not sure I want you to." My breath caught. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Then stop pretending this doesn't exist." "Logan," he warned, but there was no real authority in his tone, just something raw, something broken. "Just say it," I pressed. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm imagining everything." He exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. I leaned back, heart pounding. "That's what I thought." A long pause. And then, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, "It doesn't change anything." A storm raged inside me. "Then why does it feel like it does?" He closed his eyes briefly as if trying to compose himself. "Because it does." I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to say something that would shatter the distance between us. But before I could, a sudden voice interrupted, sharp, cutting. "Professor Carter?" We both turned. A colleague of his stood by the counter, watching us with thinly veiled curiosity. The moment was gone. Daniel stiffened, his entire posture shifting into something neutral, something unreadable. "Just running into a student," he said smoothly. The words cut deeper than they should have. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just needed some help with an assignment." His colleague gave a polite nod but didn't look convinced, and I knew. This was the moment everything changed. I stood up, my chest tight. "I should go." Daniel didn't stop me this time. And as I walked out of the cafe, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just forbidden, it was doomed. I didn't see Professor Carter for the rest of the weekend. I didn't text him. I didn't email him. I didn't even check if he was in his office on Monday. But when Tuesday's lecture came around, the weight of everything pressed down on me. I walked into the classroom, and for the first time I wasn't sure if I could meet his gaze. But when I looked up, he was already watching me. There was no trace of warmth in his expression, just a carefully crafted indifference. Like that night in the cafe had never happened. I swallowed hard and took my seat. He went through the lesson like usual, his voice steady, detached. But something was different. He wasn't looking at me. Not once. It shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. And then, as class ended and students began to leave, I stayed behind. I waited until the room was empty, my heart hammering in my chest. He was collecting his notes when I finally spoke. "So that's it then?" My voice was quiet, but I knew he heard me. He stilled. Then, slowly, he looked up. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something that told me this wasn't easy for him either. "Logan," he sighed, rubbing his temple. "You need to stop this." I clenched my fists. "Stop what? Acknowledging that something is happening here?" He exhaled sharply. "There is nothing happening here." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Right. So, the way you look at me, the way you tense up when I'm near you, that's all in my head?" His jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter." "But it does," I shot back. "And you know it." He closed his eyes briefly before stepping closer, too close. "Do you think this is easy for me?" His voice was low, strained. "Do you think I don't?" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "It doesn't change the fact that this is wrong." My breath caught. "Then tell me you don't feel it." Silence. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then, he did something reckless. He reached out. His fingers brushed against my wrist, hesitant, almost trembling. It was barely a touch, but it sent a shiver through me. I looked up, and for the first time his guard was completely down. I could see everything, the longing, the hesitation, the battle he was fighting with himself. But then, just as quickly as it happened, he pulled away. His expression shut down. "This can't happen," he whispered. Something inside me cracked. I stepped back, my chest tight. "Then why did you just touch me?" He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. I turned, walking out of the classroom without another word. But as I reached the hallway, I realized something. That moment, however brief, however forbidden, it was real. And it should never have happened. I didn't go to class the next day, or the day after that. I told myself it was because I needed space, that if I avoided him, the feelings would fade. That the moment we shared in the empty classroom, the touch, the silent confession, wasn't as significant as it felt. But I was lying to myself. It wasn't just a moment. It was everything. By the time Friday came, I knew I couldn't run forever, so I went. I walked into the lecture hall 10 minutes early, hoping to get myself together before he arrived. But when I stepped inside, the room wasn't empty. He was already there. Professor Carter sat at his desk, staring down at a closed book. His posture was tense, his fingers gripping the edge of the cover as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. He looked up at the sound of my footsteps. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, he stood. "Logan," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I forced a smile. "Didn't think you'd miss me." His jaw tightened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Pretend like this is easy." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "It doesn't have to be hard, Daniel." The name slipped out before I could stop it. His eyes darkened. "That's not who I am to you." My stomach twisted. "Isn't it?" He took a step forward. "You know this has to stop." I swallowed hard. "And what if I don't want it to?" His breath hitched, his fingers flexing at his sides. "Then I have to be the one who does." I hated how much those words hurt. I took a shaky breath. "So that's it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me like he was memorizing every detail, every unspoken thought. Finally, he said, "I got an offer from another university." My heart stopped. "What?" He looked away. "It's in another state. I've been considering it for a while." I let out a hollow laugh. Convenient timing. Logan. Just admit it. I cut him off, my voice raw. You're running. Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, I have to. I felt my hands shake. And that's supposed to make this easier? No, he admitted, but it's the only way to make it right. I bit the inside of my cheek, forcing myself to keep it together. You were the one who told me to stop pretending, I said, my voice breaking. So why are you pretending now? He closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. Because pretending is the only thing keeping me from doing something I can't take back. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I clenched my fists, my entire body screaming at me to say something, to do something. But I didn't, because I knew. This was the end. I turned to leave, but before I could step through the door, his voice stopped me. Logan. I froze. For a second, I let myself believe he was going to stop me, that he was going to tell me to stay, that this wasn't over. But all he said was, take care. I didn't turn around. I walked out of that room, out of his life, and never looked back. But that night, as I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. Some people come into your life like an impossible equation, something you try to solve over and over, knowing the answer will never change. Daniel Carter was that for me. A problem with no solution. A love that was never meant to be. Some loves aren't meant to be, but that doesn't make them any less real. Logan and Daniel were two souls who found something undeniable in each other, something rare, something raw. But in the end, love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let go. Have you ever experienced a love that couldn't be? A connection that felt so right, yet so impossible? Let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. More unforgettable stories are coming soon.